Even though ISA slots have been absent from motherboards for at least 2 decades, there's still no shortage of ISA sound cards on places like eBay. But most of these cards are lower end compatibles and less desirable models that don't really get a lot of attention. Sure, most of them will probably do just fine for a DOS retro gaming system, but if you're looking for something a bit more special, maybe like one of the original Sound Blasters or a Gravis Ultrasound, be prepared to shell out a pretty huge sum of money. And that's if you can even find one. I don't remember much from economics, but I do remember the law of supply and demand, and that certainly comes into play here. But if you're not a collector insisting on the original hardware, there are some very interesting alternatives out there. Today I'm going to be looking at a pair of clones that aim to replicate the original cards as closely as possible for 100% compatibility. And that includes all of their quirks, limitations, and other faults too. This is the Sound Blaster 1.5 and Gravis Ultrasound Plug-and-Play clone created by David E Larsson, and I hope I pronounced your name right there. And no, despite being an expert cloner, David does not live on a planet beyond the outer rim called Camino. He is actually from Sweden, a country probably almost as cold as Canada, and he was kind enough to send me samples of both of these cards to review here today. So first up here is the clone of the famous Sound Blaster, the 8-bit ISA sound card that really started it all. This card aims to be a functionally perfect replica that behaves exactly like the original, but David did add a couple of nice enhancements too that I'll get into shortly. I'm not going to get too much into the history of the Sound Blaster, this is going to become a really long video, but it was a very special card for numerous reasons. Prior to the Sound Blaster, the real standard in computer audio was the Ad-Lib Music synthesizer card released in 1987. It provided FM sound with a Yamaha OPL2 chip on board. Creative had a competing product called the Creative Music System, released that same year, but neither of these cards could output PCM digital audio, at least not without some software trickery anyway. The original Sound Blaster was marketed as a jack-of-all-trades that provided Creative Music System compatibility, 100% ad-lib compatibility, and a new quote-unquote DSP or digital sound processor that could handle PCM digital audio. It was only 8-bit mono at up to 23 kilohertz, but it was something very new at the time, that's for sure. But that wasn't all. It also provided a game port for joysticks, which was a first for a sound card, and it also included a MIDI interface for external synthesizers. It was Creative's own proprietary solution and not MPU-401 compatible, but still, at the time, that was a very impressive list of features, and it's no surprise that it set the standard for what was to come in the 90s. Probably the best known modern clone of the original Sound Blaster is the Snark Barker. What an awesome name. It was a very impressive reverse engineering effort done by TubeTime. His design and the required firmware were shared with the public a few years back. The Snark Barker aimed to be not only 100% compatible, but it also had an almost identical PCB design too, so it looked pretty much like the original. David's design was inspired by the Snark Barker, as he gives credit on the silk screening, but his design doesn't try to keep the original appearance. It has a much shorter PCB and simplified layout that uses smaller and more modern surface mount components instead of the original through-hole varieties, with the exception of the actual audio chips, of course, like the OPL2 and CMS components. He also completely redesigned the power supply circuitry, and he used a 4-layer PCB with a separate ground plane. So all of these things have helped to improve audio quality, something that the original Sound Blaster didn't have a particularly good reputation for. He also designed the card in such a way that certain needed components can be used in a variety of form factors. So for example, the DSP chip can be a 40-pin socketed type or a much smaller QFP package. The same goes for the OPL2 chip and others too. So this is a great idea because as availability of one type changes, it's very easy for him to just switch to another. Alright, so let's take a quick tour of the important ICs on the card here. So the chip that really works all the magic on the original Sound Blaster is the DSP or digital sound processor. Everything else on the card is pretty much off-the-shelf components, and although many people assumed it was some kind of a custom-designed IC, it was actually an Intel 8051 microcontroller with Creative's own firmware loaded onto it. So there's a really great presentation done by TubeTime that goes into a lot of detail on what was necessary to extract this custom firmware, and it was not a trivial exercise, and it was actually very interesting. So I'll include a link in the description for anyone who'd like to learn more about how that was done. But anyway, that firmware did make its way into the Snark Barker, and it's also used by David for his clones. So this particular card uses an Atmel branded 8051 compatible for this purpose. Another important chip is the Yamaha YM3812 FM synthesizer, better known as the Yamaha OPL2. And this was the key component in the original AdLib card and allows the Sound Blaster to be 100% AdLib compatible. And last but not least, there are two CMS chips, a pair of Philips SAA 1099s. And technically, the Sound Blaster 1.5 didn't actually include these, but there were sockets there for anyone who wanted to add CMS compatibility. As I mentioned, David did include a few enhancements to the original design. His latest revision includes a CD-ROM audio header, something the original cards lacked, as CD technology didn't really find its way into PCs yet. There are 3 of them on the top edge of the card, each with a different pinout for convenience. Great feature that makes the card even more versatile in a retro build. Another really awesome feature is the jumper for disabling the onboard amplifier. This did not exist on the original Sound Blaster. It had that great big iconic volume wheel, but even when turned down, you've still got an amplifier in the audio path, and you've got the potential for audio quality issues. Since almost everyone uses amplified speakers or headphones these days, there's really no need for it, and line out is definitely the way to go. Yet another simple modern convenience that David added to make the card even better. Next up is a clone of a card that's becoming a bit of a unicorn in the retro PC scene, the Gravis Ultrasound, or in this case, the Ultrasound Plug and Play to be precise. After the release of the Sound Blaster, the door was open to a huge wave of compatibles from many manufacturers. Advanced Gravis was one of the few companies that decided to take the road less traveled and go their own way with a completely new and state-of-the-art hardware setup. It boasted up to 16-bit 44 kHz stereo playback, depending on the number of channels or voices used, and a powerful hardware mixer that supported up to 32 channels in total. But what was most revolutionary about the card was its MIDI capabilities. It was one of the first consumer sound cards to use instrument samples stored in onboard RAM. This was commonly known as wavetable audio. Depending on the samples loaded, it could provide much more realistic sounding music than what was provided by FM chips like the OPL2 and 3. They took a pretty major risk with it because by 1992, Sound Blaster and AdLib compatibility was considered the norm, and Gravis didn't include hardware support for either. To take full advantage of the card, game and software support was required. They did, however, provide software emulation for games that couldn't support the GUS or be patched for it, but sadly, it sounded pretty awful, and it was very quirky and used a lot of memory too. But for games and software designed to make the most of the GUS, the result was very impressive. And even though support didn't become as widespread as they had hoped, the card gained a very faithful following in the demo scene during the 90s, and it has become a very special card in its own right. As I mentioned earlier, David's GUS clone here is not a clone of the original Ultrasound, but of the Ultrasound Plug and Play released a few years later in 1995. This was a new card that used the revamped AMD Interwave, also known as the GF1A. Although it bears the AMD logo, Gravis licensed the GF1A and software to AMD, who were trying to get into the sound card game at the time. The new Interwave had a number of improvements over the original GUS, including support for more RAM, and it didn't need to drop the sample rate when more than 14 voices were used. It also had an onboard ROM chip with some preloaded audio samples, and came with numerous software enhancements that I'm not going to get into today. Like the Sound Blaster, there's been a few clones created of the Gravis Ultrasound Plug and Play over the years, thanks to somewhat decent availability of the AMD Interwave chip, at least for now anyway. There's also been some amazing work done by Ian Scott on the PicoGUS, which uses a Raspberry Pi Pico to emulate the GUS on the ISA bus. And although original hardware is awesome, not everybody wants to spend $300 or probably a lot more to get an original GUS these days. Not to mention that they don't have the best reputation for reliability after over 30 years of aging either. David's clone is a reverse engineering of another clone, which was actually a clone too. But as you can see, it's got a really sleek looking PCB with a very minimal layout and a beautiful red color. His first batch of cards were actually green, which understandably generated a bit of an outcry. I mean, how can a GUS be anything other than red? You'll notice a few things were actually omitted on this clone too that existed on the original card, including the CD-ROM IDE header and the circuitry to provide microphone power. Both of these features most people don't care about, especially if it means that the card can be sold at a lower price. Unlike the original, which used 30-pin SIMs for memory, David's card supports the cheaper and easier to find 72-pin variety. Even though the Interwave can support 16 megabytes, the original card only officially supported 8, with two 4-megabyte SIMs installed. But with a 72-pin SIM, it's really easy to get the full 16 on there, so why not? Now, if only we could find some red memory modules. Could be a good project for the future, perhaps. Oh, and I should talk about brackets. So David has two options available for his clones. Normally they include plastic 3D printed brackets, but he also has metal ones available for an extra cost if you are interested. Now, I didn't realize this was even a thing, but it's possible to 3D print in some kind of metal composite now. Pretty awesome, and they have a really solid feel to them. Alright, so let's try these two cards out. I'm going to try a mix of a few things, both games and software titles that are well suited to each card, and I'll be using my Pentium-based sound card testing rig here, which is admittedly too fast for something like an original Sound Blaster, but I can easily slow it down to 386 levels by disabling the cache on it. I'm not going to get too much into the software setup for these cards since, well, being clones, they work exactly like the originals and use the original software and drivers too. The non-plug-and-play Sound Blaster is a total joy to set up because there's literally nothing needed. You just set your blaster variable in DOS and away you go. But with the GUS, you get to enjoy all the frustration that comes along with their quirky software installers and utilities, just like people did with the real thing back in the day, all part of the GUS experience. But in all seriousness, a few tips. Don't try to use the original GUS installer disks for the plug-and-play version. It won't work properly. There is a set of floppy disks and a CD that you will need. The software and drivers are on the floppy, and the required MIDI patch set is stored on the CD, and I'll include links to where you can find these. Also, contrary to popular belief, the GUS plug-and-play is not totally backward compatible with the original GUS in all situations. A lot of games out there do need patching to support it properly. There's an executable called Prep Game that comes with the installer that can fix a number of titles, but there's also lots of information online if you do run into any problems. So beginning with the Sound Blaster, first up is Lemmings, released back in 1991. I've got a lot of fond memories of this one, playing it on my best friend's IBM EduQuest system with PC speaker audio. Didn't experience the game with sound until later on, but I still have fun picking this one up once in a while. Next up is Biomenace, released back in 1993. It was published by Apogee, but uses ID Software's Commander Keen game engine. This one's a lot of fun, and it's got a really great ad-lib soundtrack. Next, I wanted to try something that uses the Creative Music System or CMS chips on the card. They've got a really unique sound to them and were supported by a number of games in the late 80s and early 90s, including many of the Sierra classics. Since I wanted to try something that was familiar to many people, here is The Secret of Monkey Island. Really cool sounding and very different than ad-lib, that's for sure. It's full of beeps and bloops and seems unapologetically choppy at times, but I love it. Really need to be able to experience this in games that can support it. But one of the best parts about using an original Sound Blaster is the compatibility. Not only will the card work with games from the late 80s, but that support carried forward to pretty much every single newer DOS title too, including games from the Doom series and many others. Alright, so let's switch over to the Gravis Ultrasound Plug and Play clone and see how it does. Many games that support the GUS and have MIDI soundtracks will have a pretty different sound to them. That familiar FM synthesis is replaced with wavetable audio instead. The results can vary, and it may not always be to your taste, but here's what it sounds like in Raptor Call of the Shadows, released in 1994. The GUS's wavetable audio can be very impressive, but one of its biggest advantages is hardware mixing of up to 32 channels, which takes substantial burden off the CPU and allows some pretty impressive sound to come out of slower 386 and 486 systems. This makes it particularly well suited to trackers and mod music. And that means that games that use mod music and support the GUS's hardware mixing capabilities often have a very noticeable advantage in both sound quality and in performance. Here's one such game, Epic Pinball, released in 1993. Another great game that makes good use of the GUS's hardware is Jazz Jackrabbit, also by Epic Mega Games and released in 1994. But what the Gravis Ultrasound will probably be best remembered for is its popularity in the demo scene. Here is Dope by Complex, released in 1995, a demo that will only work on a GUS. No sound blasters allowed here. So there you have it. After throwing many games, applications, and demos at these cards, I can confidently say that the claims of 100% compatibility are good. Not that I doubted it, but yeah. As I mentioned in my last review, sound quality can be quite subjective, and it's really hard to get good recordings to demonstrate minor differences, especially when you're dealing with retro games that use lower sampling rates to begin with. The 8-bit Sound Blaster is not going to be an amazing sounding card with its hardware limitations on the best of days, but I can say that there is some minor improvement in audio quality when I compare David's clone with my 30-plus-year-old Sound Blaster 1.5. There's less background noise, and I do notice improved clarity in some games too. Being able to bypass that onboard amplifier is a great feature, and I'm sure it's playing a role here. I don't have a GUS plug-in play to compare against, but unlike the early Sound Blasters, the Gravis cards generally have really clean output, and David's clone sounds great and is no different. Alright, so let's talk about price. David currently sells the Sound Blaster clone for $109 US, including a plastic 3D printed bracket, or you can get a metal one for an extra $25. Now, considering how rare and expensive the original Sound Blaster cards have become, I think this is an excellent value. And of course, you'll get to enjoy the better sound quality and other enhancements too. When it comes to the GUS clone, you have a couple of options. So David has the red version that I reviewed today for $180 US, and a cheaper green version that omits the ROM chip for only $150. Now, I don't think the ROM's really used for all that much, to be honest, and you're going to be loading samples into the memory anyway, so it's nice to have a cheaper option available. You'll be really hard-pressed to find a working GUS card for even twice this price, so it's an excellent value. David has his products on Tindie as well as eBay, but you will find better pricing on his Tindie storefront due to the fees that eBay charges sellers. When it comes to shipping, considering it's coming all the way from Sweden, I think the cost is very reasonable, and in my case, it's only $15 US to get it all the way to Canada. David's a real wizard when it comes to creating these clones, and he's already been telling me about some of the other projects he's working on, so you should definitely check out his website and see what he's got cooking. You'll find links to his site and where you can buy these clones in the description below. So that's it for today. I know a lot of you have been asking when the next repair video is coming, and I am happy to say that I got a few of them in the pipeline, including a 3DFX enhancement job and a couple of card repairs too, so stay tuned for that. Thanks very much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you enjoy my channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Your contributions help me to purchase more interesting retro hardware to share, better tools, and to help cover some expenses. You'll also get some perks like early access to my videos, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, and your name listed at the end of all my videos. You can find more information in the description below. Thanks again.